In this video, I'll show several methods to get a scatterplot matrix and correlation heat map when we have a set of x variables we wish to correlate with a set of y variables. For this example, I'm using the US demographics sample dataset that's available in the sample data directory. Now to start, let's look at what JMP will produce when we use the multivariate platform. Now multivariate will produce correlation matrices and heat maps looking at the combination of all variables against each other. So if I take a set of these variables, put them into Y, and hit OK, our scatterplot matrix shows each variable against each other variable, and our correlation matrix shows each variable against each other. And if we go to the red triangle and produce the color map on correlations, this color map will show each variable produced against each other variable. Now, of course, there are redundant cells here, so if we just look at the lower triangle, we see each pair of variables and the correlation between them. Say we wish to have this correlation heat map, but showing just a set of these variables, the first 5, and their correlations with the later 5. To produce that, we'll need to do something different in JMP. First, let's look at how we can produce a scatterplot matrix showing those relationships. Now, there are two methods for this. The first is we'll use under graph the scatterplot matrix option. And scatterplot matrix has an x and a y section, unlike multivariate, which simply had a y section. Here, I'll take the first 5 variables, put them as my x, and the last 5 as my y. I don't have to toggle anything for matrix format because JMP will, by default, produce the square of the first 5 against the later 5. Now, this is one way to produce this scatterplot matrix. Let me show you another way. If I go to Graph Builder, Graph Builder allows us to invoke a dialog if I click the dialog button. Here, I can take again the first 5 variables as my x, the last 5 as my y, and I'll toggle a graph matrix. This will make a matrix of each of those y's against each of those x's with these options. I'll have points toggled, but let me change the smoother to an ellipse. So let me go down to ellipse here. When I click OK, JMP will produce the output. We get a lot of legend output, so I'm going to suppress that by going to the red triangle, turn off show legend. I'll hit done, and let me stretch this out to make them more square. And so now we again have a scatterplot matrix showing each y against each x. Now this is one way to produce the scatterplot matrices, but what if we wanted to produce that heat map that we found in multivariate? To produce the heat map, we'll need to do something different. First, I'll go to Analyze, Fit Y by X, and what I'll do is take the first 5 variables again as my x, the last 5 as my y, and click OK. JMP will produce the matrix of the y's against the x's, and what we can do is get the correlations for each y and each x from this platform. To do this, I'm going to hold down the Command key because I'm on a Mac. If you're on a PC, you'll use the Control key, because what this will do is broadcast any command I select for any of these Fit Y by X outputs. Here, I'll go and select Density Ellipse and select 95%. This will put the 95% density ellipse on each of these separate x by y outputs. Next, let me expand one of these sections, and you'll see that we're given the correlation in the section here. I'm going to right-click and select Make Combine Data Table. What this will do is search that Fit Y by X output window and find every instance of this table, the bivariate normal ellipse table. Since I produced it for each one of those outputs, I get a combined data set that has the output from every one of those x and y combinations. Now, we have some extra cells here, so I'm going to right-click the blank and select matching so I can delete these rows. Next, I'll delete some of the extra columns I have. Variable is actually redundant with x, and mean and standard deviation are necessary for us, so I'm going to right-click and delete those columns. And now what we have is our x and y correlations. So we have for each of the different combinations, just each x versus each y. Now what we can do is make a heat map of these correlations. I'll go to Graph, Graph Builder. I'll take x and put that on my x. I'll take y, put it on my y. Let me take the heat map, so I'll click on heat map here, and then I'll use correlation as my color. And so now JMP will actually color this heat map by the correlations. If you wish to change the gradient, let me right-click and I'll select gradient here. Since we have a scale that naturally is bounded from -1 to +1, it makes sense to have a diverging scale. So I'll actually select diverging here. Let me click OK and OK again. And now we have a heat map showing us the correlation between each x and each y. If we like, we can instead show the significance probability. I can simply drag that on top of the color here, and we'll actually get for the p-value now a heat map of those. Now there's some additional things we can do. Let me close this output. And what I'll do is I'll keep this table open, the one that has my correlations. But what I'm going to do is go back to my fit y by x output. And what I want to do is save these graphs so we can use them as markers actually in the output. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to right click on one of these graphs. I'll go to Edit and select Make a Table of Graphs like this. Now jump 12 allows columns to be expression columns, which means if I make this table and expand the row size, that I actually have a column in this data set that is the graphic of those bivariate fits. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to minimize the fit y by x output, and I want to combine this table with my table of correlations. Now to do that, I'll simply go to the Tables, Update menu with this first table selected. I'll select the second table, and I'm going to tell it I want to match columns, because what I want is to match the x with the x in the second table. I'll click Match, and the y to match the y in the second table. This will mean that JMP can update this second table with the right rows from the first table. And what I'll tell JMP is that I want to bring in selected rows. I want to bring in that picture, so the P column here. When I click OK, what JMP will do is add in that picture to now my original table, so the one that has the correlations. And what I'll finally do is select that column, right-click, and tell it that I want to label on the basis of this column. Now here's what this will do. Let me go back to Graph Builder. I'm going to remake my graph with the heat map. So I'll take X, put it as my X, and Y, put it as my Y. I want to keep the points because what will happen is when I hover, I can actually look at the correlation scatter plot and the density ellipse for it. But what I'm going to do is this. I'll click on the heat map. I'll take the correlation and color by the correlation, and I'll drag the points back on. And by dragging the points, notice that they're actually in the plot. So now I can hover anywhere in this plot to get the pop-up of the correlation. So again, let me change the gradient. Let me double-click, change my color theme. Let me make this diverging. I can do the same thing for the other color gradient if I want to change those. And when I click Done, now I get this plot where I can even hover and I can see the scatter plot for each one. It's not just showing the correlation, but giving me a peek into what the data look like whenever I want to hover over a point. All right, so that's how we can actually create an X by Y correlation scatter plot and a matrix. If we wish to do this for other types of variables, not just the correlation within a Pearson framework, but within a Spearman's, we could do something very similar. Again, we just need to produce a table that has the X and the Y here, and then we can produce the heat map. So to produce this for other types of correlations, we can use the actual multivariate platform. And let's try this again. I'll take all my variables this time, click them into Y. Now, from multivariate, we have the option to do nonparametric correlations. So I'll produce the Spearman's row for this one. Now, this table can be saved as a data table itself if I right-click and select Make into Data Table. But if we were to make a heat map out of this data table, we would have the combination of every X and Y, rather than a certain set of X's against a certain set of Y's. So we need to get rid of some rows in this table. Now there's a simple way we can do this. Let me go back to the data set I created that had my X's and my Y's. So I believe it was JMP 5 or Untitled 5. Because what we can do is use tables update, the same function we use to bring in the picture. We can use that to search this other table and bring in just these combinations, the Y's and the X's that we wish to have the correlations of, but now Spearman's row. To do this, let me go to Tables, Update, and again, we're going to match our Untitled 5 with this new data set, Untitled 8. I'll select Match Columns, and now we have to choose which of these X's and Y's is matching. Now, if you look at the tables, we can see which one of these will have the values we want. It looks like the bi variable is the one that'll have population, and so we actually want to match the X against the bi variable and the Y against the variable. Once we've done this, I'll click Selected, and let's bring in just the Spearman's row. And notice what this will do now is when this table searches in this Untitled 8 table, it'll bring in only the correct rows that match the bi and the Y variables we have. So let me hit OK. And now this table brings in a Spearman's row. So let's actually create our plot again, now a heat map using Spearman's row instead of the correlation coefficient that's Pearson's correlation. So I'll go back to Graph Builder. Here, I'll put the X again as my X. I'll put Y again as my Y. And I can turn on a heat map, and instead of using the correlation, let me drag Spearman's row as my color. Again, if we want to bring the points on, I can drag the points on top, And since those points are still labeled, we can actually have them pop up to show us the actual scatter plot. So this is a way to create those heat maps with really whatever kind of summary statistic you want, whether it be the correlation or Spearman's rho or any other. And so the trick is, once you have this table of the x's and the y's, you can update it against really any other table that has a statistic you wish to show.